agora passamos para a fala da Evânia Reich, pós-doutoranda aqui do nosso departamento, cujo título é Social Suffering in Brazil Within the Limits of Human Rights.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. É um grande prazer estar participando desse evento. Eu gostaria de agradecer ao professor Canizani pelo convite. É uma grande alegria dividir a mesa com o professor Denilson, por quem eu tenho uma grande estima. A minha fala vai ser em inglês. As perguntas podem ser feitas para quem fala em português, eu prefiro que sejam feitas em português. Para o público, obviamente, vou tentar respondê-las em inglês. This article is part of my research in my postdoctorate, in which I explore the concept of social suffering, but only in this part, because differently from my main work, where I want to analyze the category of precariat, in this colloquium I want to speak about violence, especially the violence caused by military intervention that is happening in Rio de Janeiro since 2007, last year. Okay, I had to cut out a part of my paper in order to respect the time, the speaking time. For this reason, some parts are very short, but I think you can still understand my point of view. I hope so. Okay. The image of violence in Brazil are much more telling than any attempt at summing up the episodes of daily violence in the various capitals of the country. Rio de Janeiro is the ubiquitous example in national and international news programs because of its landmark status, yet it is not even the country's most violent city. Nevertheless, it has been a city under siege since July 2017, and therefore its example will be the basis for all study of the limits of human rights as a cause of social suffering. Rio de Janeiro's population can be divided into two large groups, according to the very inhabitants of the favelas, the asphalt population living in affluent areas, and the population of the hills, where most of the favelas are located. We shall use that terminology all along our text. Military presence with its armored vehicles and tanks have been positioned on the main access roads to the city. Those measures were welcomed by the asphalt population, who felt that at last something was going to be done to bring under control criminal activities in Central Rio. The operation in the state of Rio de Janeiro, labeled Rio Wants Safety and Peace, mobilized 8,500 soldiers from the army, 620 from the National Guards, and 1,120 from the Federal Military Police. It is not the first time that the military has occupied important streets and points of Rio, but until now, they mainly had well-defined functions, such as protection duties during diplomatic summits or during the Olympics, or temporary occupation of communities, such as the Operation Rio in 1994. However, military presence has become more frequent over the last years, a factor which has brought about questions on the role of the armed forces within the Brazilian territory. The legitimacy of military action to defend citizens can be questioned When one considers that soldiers are trained to kill enemies and not to protect the population. The tactics of territorial occupation aim at invading foreign countries, and their target is foreign fighters. Yet, in that context of confusion of roles, what has been witnessed, whenever the media can or is willing to have access to images and information, is the killing of Brazilian citizens at the hands of Brazilian soldiers and vice versa. There are numerous examples of mistakes made by the military against the civilian population, causing the losses of adults and children who live in the favelas and in conflict zones. In June this year, the whole country mourned the death of young Marcos Vinicius da Silva, shot in the abdomen by soldiers from the civilian police. The youngster heard shots being fired while walking to school and decided to return home, fearing he would not have time to avoid the area where the shots came from. Even so, when he was about to reach his home, he was shot by a policeman from an armored vehicle. Before he died, his last words referred to what had just happened. Quote, "Ma'am, I know who shot me. I saw who shot me. It was the armored car, Mom. They didn't see me with my school uniform." Examples similar to the case of young Vinicius occur recurrently during military operations, whether in Rio de Janeiro or in other states. Brazil holds the record of homicides by militaries against civilians. It is well known that there is a considerable structural problem which demands reforms in the police forces. Many bills are gathering dust in the National Congress, while short-term solutions are pursued by the federal and the state governments, which at first delude the asphalt population, but which entail huge suffering for the population of the hills and the suburbs of all large cities. The life of poor populations in Brazil is traditionally the target of repressive policies which cause anxiety, traumas, and death, destroying families. The main goal of the present article is to draw a relationship between the social suffering of the poor population, inhabitants of the favelas and the suburbs, with the violence generated by military operation and by the state against its own citizens. In the first part, the article shall discuss the question of the disrespect of human rights in the police action against the population of the hills and suburbs, based on the idea of the end of human rights developed by Costas Douzinas. In accordance with his idea that the new era ushered in by 21st century, especially in the aftermath of the attacks of September 11, brought about a legitimation of violence in coercion beyond the protection of human rights. The present article wishes to study the end of the protection of human rights in the context of the violence generated by the Brazilian state power through military intervention in the favelas of Rio. In the second part, we shall study the question of the theorization of social suffering. With Manuel Renault, we shall ponder the imperative necessity to work with the category of social suffering in critical theory, with the aim of enhancing the visibility of social suffering through the voices of the dominated. This article is an attempt at a critical theory through examples of violence and disrespect from Brazilian institutions towards the poor in Brazil who live in the favelas and are confronted on a daily basis with the suspicious look and violent actions of a system which owes them protection. According to Costas Douzinas, the new century brought about a return of perverted practice from the state, which had been universally condemned and had disappeared, at least in the Western world, such as torture in the camps and prisons, notoriously in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. And in the aftermath of September 11 and the various attacks in European countries, governments responded by introducing drastic anti-terrorist measures, restraining immigration, and increasing surveillance over so-called suspected people and groups. Such measures reaching an ever-increasing part of the population. All of a sudden, the optimistic era of globalized hope turned into the somber era of fear. As a consequence, the suspicion of the principles of human rights seems something plausible to and supported by governments and the public, both which are dominated by the fear of the enemy. Douzinas asserts that, quote, all forecast of the end of human rights seems to turn into a reality. To Douzinas, it is legitimate to question whether human rights actually continue being an effective defensive tool against domination and oppression, or the ideological gloss of an emerging empire. The measures and military intervention in the favelas accepted by a part of the asphalt population and decided by the Brazilian governments also entail an exception with regards to the respect of human rights, especially the one towards the poorer part of the population. The state is not interested in defending and protecting the inhabitants of the favelas, but rather, in the best of cases, in attempting to solve the problem of the violence which reaches the areas where the asphalt population lives, and in the worst case, in promoting their political and electoral agenda. Referring to questions about the military intervention during the Afghan war and the press of humanitarian organizations, Douzinas quoted the head of USAID, quote, "We are not here because of hunger or draft or women's condition. We are here because of September 11. We are here because of Osama bin Laden." The same can be said about our own military interventions. We are not there in the favelas because of boys and girls who feel unsafe when they leave home to school or to the playground. Neither are we there because of the locals who leave their homes to work in the asphalt areas of the city and don't know if they will make it back. We are not there to diminish the anxiety of the inhabitants who live in areas of excessive structure and institutional precariousness. We are there to put an end to violence. But which violence? The violence against most of the inhabitants of the favelas? As pointed out by Dunker, quote, "The trap lies in thinking that all these bears only one name, violence, and that by fighting this issue, we are actually solving all the rest that is hidden behind it. Nothing could be further from the truth." Okay, this is the first voice. It was a mistake from the police. How could they not see the school uniform? An orange rucksack? They saw my son, and even so, they shot. Mourn José Gerson da Silva, Marcos Vinícius' father, the youngster who was shot in the back by policemen who were in an armored car in the Maré Complexo in Rio. The state targeted a child who was walking to school. They invaded communities to destroy families, says the boy's mother, Bruna Silva, who works as a maid in the asphalt area. Homicidal police. They come in to kill? He was my elder. They shut up my son, but I am not going to shut up. For him I shall speak, says Bruna. According to her, witnesses begged the policeman not to shoot. Quote, a young woman told me that servant, don't shoot. He is a child. He is in a school uniform. But they just didn't care, and they shot. The desperate mother cries. The third article of the Declaration of Human Rights would be sufficient to protect the victims of reckless criminal acts by the military in Rio de Janeiro. Every individual has a right to life, freedom, and safety of their own person. But we can go beyond that. What does it mean when someone screams, "Don't shoot, he is wearing a school uniform"? Does it indeed mean that we have to prove that we deserve the protection of the police? That to be protected is a matter of merit? The liberal ideology of meritocracy seems to permeate the voices of the sufferers of violence in its economic meaning. What kind of ideological trap is this, which demands that we show that people are good to be able to grant them their most elementary rights, to right to life? Okay. To describe a few sporadic cases of violence perpetrated by state institutions, such as the army or the Polícia Civil, is a difficult task because it covers a tiny part of what can be said about such widespread violence. And even if we could cover every type of violence, we would still not be able to achieve a concrete representation of so complex a phenomenon. Faced with the reality experienced by the inhabitants of the urban areas of Greater Rio, it always seems superficial. To quote Bourdieu in La Misère du Monde, the so-called difficult places, such as the cité or the school, are primarily difficult to describe and to reflect upon, and we need to substitute simplistic and one-sided images, especially those conveyed by the media, with a complex and multiple representation based on the expression of the same realities in different discourses, sometimes irreconcilable ones, and just like the novelists such as Faulkner, Joyce, or Virginia Woolf, forsake the single, central, dominant, in short, almost divine point of view, where the observer as well as the reader joyfully stands in favor of a plurality of perspectives corresponding to the plurality of coexisting and sometimes competing points of view. Final thought. In the face of all the discourse against the military violence in the favelas and outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, as well as in other cities in Brazil, there will always be a discourse which contains that the military also suffers from violence, soldiers being murdered by bandits on a daily basis. This is unquestionable. Yet, such a discourse is dangerous because at the same time as it legitimates and justifies state violence for a large majority of the population, it fails to tackle the real issue, which has to do with the protection of the citizens' right to live and come and go in conflict zones where militarization seems to have increased the risk of death. The risk of death is greater if you are an inhabitant of the hills or the suburbs than if you live in the asphalt areas. As pointed out by Edouard Louis, a young French novelist who wrote, among others, Qui a tué mon père, the world is divided between bodies that are protected and bodies that are destroyed. Politics have less effect on the dominant body than on the dominated body. The possession of what Bourdieu calls social capital, economic or cultural capital, acts as a protection against the effects of politics. A reform or a political decision for the poor means to die or not to die, to eat or not to eat. In Brazil, when Congress approves the freezing of public investments in health and in education for 20 years, it's not the dominant class which will be the most affected by the dominated one. The one that will no longer have doctors, medicine, beds in hospital, up-to-date medical examinations. Similarly, when the Brazilian government decides to besiege Rio de Janeiro with soldiers from the armed forces, it is not the asphalt population who is terrified and whose lives are put at risk with its operations, but the vulnerable and poor population of the hills and suburbs. In Brazil, to speak of the respect of human rights does not mean much to a good part of the population, either because the discourse of human rights is seen as a protection of the criminals, or because the language it uses does not reach less educated people, or even because of a kind of banality of evil which internalizes violence as something natural. Therefore, to make a critique of state-perpetrated violence against the weakest, the poor, the inhabitants of the favelas, through the suffering experienced by those people, is an attempt to deliver a relevant description of social evils and to encounter political subjects capable of intervening in the process of social transformation. According to Emmanuel Renault, there is a convergent point in critical theories which covers the whole range of political opinions, from the advocates of neoliberalism to the opponents of mainstream political thinking. Even though a description of the reality of suffering should be one of the essential tasks of fundamental policies, there is an ever-increasing hesitation to admit that the category of suffering might designate a genuine social issue liable to become the object of a relevant political use. Renault's goal in his book Social Sufferings is precisely to demonstrate that the political reference to suffering can contribute to a resumption of social critique. Not even suffering is of political interest, but the description of the reality experienced in the suffering linked to domination, violence and injustice can constitute the object of a discourse which enables us to go beyond questions linked to economic efficiency or equal respect of universal rights, and above all, which makes it possible to escape the society of invisibility, enabling the suffering individuals to call for a transformation of their existence and to collectively act to that purpose. Therefore, suffering in Emmanuel Renault brings about the discussion on how that category can designate genuine social issues which allow a relevant political use. With that concept, the author points out that domination not only occurs in the economic sphere, and in this sense, the goal is to determine how a study of social suffering can contribute to a resumption of a critique adapted to the social question which takes into account social suffering. In order to tackle the social suffering resulting from wrong social practice and mechanisms, philosophy will resort to a certain epistemological range. According to Emmanuel Renaud, the way in which the problematics of social suffering is developed stems from a pluridisciplinary practice, that is, from the use of concepts and methods which come from various disciplines. He's not talking of a collaboration between various disciplines, but rather of the use of concepts and complementary observations about common objects. It is in this sense that for the study of violence as a cause of suffering, social philosophy must borrow knowledge and findings from sociology, psychology, the ethnology of violence, of extreme poverty, for example. Anthropologist Chapel Hughes, in her study of violence in Brazil, published in the book To Die in Silence, analyzed the way in which the violence and the dehumanization which occur in the favelas constitute not only aggravation factors of social suffering for their poor and miserable inhabitants, but also how a discourse of justification of armed violence exerted over the inhabitants is common within Brazilian society. Nancy Shepherd Hughes shows clearly how the bodies and deaths of the poor can become invisible or justifiable in areas of the extreme poverty in Brazil. The question of the invisibility of suffering linked to precariousness, unemployment, exclusion and poverty appears as a characteristic of today's world. For this very reason, one of the goals of social critique is to make the various forms of social suffering visible. Okay. I'm going to finish here. It is undeniable. Okay, before this, according to Renaud, it is undeniable that the social invisibility of suffering contributes even more to the very suffering and constitutes an even bigger obstacle to collective mobilization. When the individuals who suffer remaining invisible, they naturalize their suffering and start believing that this is their fate or feel guilty about it. This is why when social sciences refute to the problematic of social suffering, they extended to their discourse the silence of the public political space on the experience of the dominated and the destitute, whilst they could, on the contrary, contribute to elaborate a discursive frame for the sharing of that experience. The absence of social descriptions of a condition makes it even more difficult for a narrative to allow the sharing of experiences and mobilization. Mobilizations is the only means to force the public political space to see a part of the population which is forgotten, despised, abandoned, and sacrificed by wrong or flawed policies. This is why, when Bourdieu, in La Misère du Monde, uses the category of suffering understood as social suffering. His goal is the exposure of a hidden misery, a criticism of the inequality of the language of the public political space, and the explicitation of the social causes of the guilt complexes, so as to disarm the propelling string as well as the factors. To describe the social process of suffering allow us to stop attributing the individual the responsibility and to contribute to a construction of suffering that can bring collective mobilization. Thank you.